Julianne Ginter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to take a call on the second reading of this bill. Despite what the previous speaker, Mr. Bishop, said, I don't think this bill is entirely a stunt at all. I think it's actually quite germane to what's happening at the moment, because although the National Party has found it politically difficult to carry out their ambitions of privatising Kiwibank, that is their intention, and that's because they don't see the purpose and the benefit to New Zealand of having a New Zealand-owned bank, a government-owned bank that can help achieve greater competition in the banking sector for New Zealanders. And that's exactly what Kiwibank has done. So the Green Party supports the bill, particularly with the excellent amendments from Honourable David Parker. And I'll note again in Clause 3, very clear purpose. The purpose of this Act is to ensure that Kiwibank continues to be owned by the New Zealand people unless and until it is absolutely clear that they no longer wish to own Kiwibank. And I think it's fair enough for the Labour Party to introduce such a bill, given the history of what's happened in the last few terms of government, where the public actually made it very clear that they didn't agree with the partial privatisation of the energy companies, and yet the government went ahead and did it anyway with their one-vote majority, even though a significant portion, I think even a majority of their own voters, didn't support that policy. The government still went ahead and did that. And of course, that privatization didn't make any economic or fiscal sense. There were a lot of arguments put forward that we needed to do it to pay down debt. Of course, that's not what happened. We ended up selling off, flooding the market with shares in energy companies, receiving a much lower value than what they were worth. And now the cost of selling them has almost been the benefit, the money that we received from selling those shares has actually almost been exceeded by the cost that we've foregone by not receiving the dividends from those companies. And of course, once you have that partial privatization, it means that private shareholders who have an interest in maximizing their returns don't necessarily have the interests of the New Zealand people when they're looking at policy. And when you have an oligopolistic situation, which is very... Mr. Speaker, point of order.
Point of order, Julianne Ginter. Before you take your point of order, I will ask Mr. Robertson to stay on his backside. Thank you.
I've just found it unbearably annoying to listen to Mr. Seymour interject in everybody's speeches this evening, and I haven't gotten up to do a point of order because I didn't want to interrupt other members' speeches, but I am going to interrupt my own speech to ask you to...
And I know because I've being a foolish person, been in the car and the radio, I was listening to Parliament for some time, and I could hear Mr. Seymour interjecting. And there is a convention here that people are more reasonable interjecting from the crossbenches, especially to colleagues on the other side who are near them. And I asked Mr. Seymour to respect that convention, to keep his interjections occasional and preferably witty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it's a very similar situation, and I think it is entirely relevant and fair that the Labour Party brought this bill to the House, given that we already have a similar situation where we have effectively an oligopoly in energy markets, and yet the government went ahead and partially privatized shares in the energy companies. And now, what we have in the banking sector is definitely an oligopoly. We have nearly 90% of all banking in this country dominated by the 4 big Aussie banks. And that lack of competition has even been noted by Standard & Poor's, who called it oligopolistic. And so, just for the benefit of Mr. Seymour in particular, who I know is very ideological and blinkered understanding of economics, but in standard economic theory, an oligopoly is a bad thing because it means there's a lack of competition and you get excessive profits, which are actually not efficient because, of course, when you have excessive economic profit, it means that the price that people are paying for a good or service is greater than the marginal cost of production of that service. And so excessive economic profit is inefficient and bad for New Zealand in particular because those profits are flowing offshore, up to $4 billion a year. that we're paying to foreign-based shareholders in these banks, and that's not getting us better services. It's not getting us better banking services. It's not getting us better mortgages. It's actually quite inefficient. And so when Kiwibank was introduced in 2001, it was very effective at lowering bank fees and ensuring that the New Zealand public, whether they bank with Kiwibank or one of the big four banks, are actually getting a fairer deal in terms of the price they pay for banking services and more likely to receive fairer mortgage interest rates. And so it is entirely reasonable and important that the New Zealand public are assured that there will not be a sale of Kiwibank unless there is a parliamentary majority in favour of that, for good reason. And it would be very difficult for me to understand what the purpose of selling Kiwibank would be, because it is incredibly beneficial to New Zealanders to have a government-owned bank which is there to compete with the big four Aussie banks. And of course, the Green Party supports strengthening Kiwibank even further, so that it can do more to compete with the big four Aussie banks. We support legislative changes that would help the credit unions and other New Zealand-owned institutions grow and be more competitive with the big four Aussie banks. And that's one of the ways that we can ensure that we won't be paying too much on mortgage interest. And it means real savings for New Zealanders. I mean, up to $600, $700 a year on their mortgages if we have a more competitive banking sector, not to mention ensuring that we have lower rates and fees. Of course, the national government has come up with their own solution. Rather than investing in Kiwibank and enabling it to compete with the big four Aussie banks, they've found a solution which is effectively a backdoor route, potentially, to privatization, because their policy is to allow Kiwibank, rather than providing the capital that Kiwibank needs more directly, the board has had to make the decision to raise capital by selling shares, probably at an undervalued rate, to government institutions with no assurance that those shares will not be on-sold to private investors. And if at one point the Crown did intend to buy them back in a period of 5 years, it could end up costing taxpayers up to $800 million. Now, it makes more sense, I think, for the government to put in directly $100 million into Kiwibank, allow them to grow their business.
Order. Thank you.
And I suppose it just speaks to the very limited understanding of the overall social and economic benefits that government can provide to its citizens on the part of this national government, that they look at short-term ways of finding a surplus. They have a very accounting-focused approach to evaluating benefits rather than looking at the overall picture of what is going to be better for New Zealand households. Why does it make sense to have a New Zealand government-owned bank if we're not going to use that bank to deliver greater benefits to the New Zealand public? And so, of course, the National Party's approach, just as it is with public television or public energy companies, is to run them on commercial grounds and eventually, potentially, sell them off. Of course, while you might get some very, very short-term benefit from that, from the point of view of trying to achieve a surplus, eventually there'll be enormous costs to the New Zealand public of not having a well-established New Zealand-owned bank which can compete with the four big Aussie banks. And so the Green Party very much supports retaining public ownership of Kiwibank, strengthening Kiwibank so it can do more to benefit New Zealanders.
Melissa Lee.